What happens when one blast does not just destroy shells, but rattles the entire spine of an occupation? Because in Crimea, one strike near a key Russian supply network may have done exactly that. Before we go deeper, do one quick thing for me. If you like sharp war analysis without the noise, tap like, subscribe, and share this video with one person who follows the war as closely as you do. At first glance, this looked like another overnight drone attack, another flash in the dark, another brief headline that disappears by morning. But the reason this story matters is not the explosion alone. It is what that explosion reveals about the way this war is changing. For a long time, Russia treated Crimea like a protected military backyard, safe enough to store fuel, safe enough to move ammunition, safe enough to route trains, trucks, and reinforcements toward the southern front. Crimea was not just symbolic ground for Moscow, it was a working logistics engine, a military warehouse, a staging platform, a shielded bridge between Russia and the forces fighting in southern Ukraine. Now that shield is looking thinner every month. Reports over time have pointed to repeated Ukrainian efforts to hit the systems that keep Russian troops supplied across the peninsula and into the occupied south. In one notable earlier case, Russian-installed authorities said an ammunition depot in the Jankoy area was hit during a Ukrainian drone attack, and road and rail traffic were suspended for safety reasons while nearby civilians were evacuated. Reuters noted that Ukrainian officials had long described Jankoy and its surrounding area as the largest military base in Crimea. That detail matters more than it may seem. Jankoy is not important because it sounds dramatic on a map. It is important because it sits near one of the most sensitive transport junctions in the north of Crimea. If you are moving military cargo into the peninsula, if you are trying to feed Russian forces spread across Crimea itself, or pushing supplies onward toward Kherson and Zaporizhzhia, nodes like Jankoy are the connectors that make the entire system work. Ammunition stored there is not just ammunition sitting still, it is future artillery fire, it is future defense against raids, it is future resupply for units that depend on a constant flow of explosives, fuel, and spare parts. And Ukraine understands that. That is why the story is bigger than a depot. Recent reporting has described a broader Ukrainian drone campaign focused on Russian logistics through occupied Crimea. Forces News reported that Ukrainian drones have been striking the routes Russia uses to move fuel, ammunition, reinforcements, and supplies through Crimea and toward the southern front. It described pressure on fuel convoys, ammunition trucks, rail hubs, and supply columns, with the campaign aimed at degrading the ground routes that connect Crimea to Russian forces fighting in southern Ukraine. That changes how we should read a strike like this. This is not just a pinprick, it is part of a pattern, and patterns are what win long wars. Think about the logic here. Russia can replace one truck, it can deny one hit, it can downplay one fire. What becomes much harder to solve is a chain reaction of disruption. A depot gets hit, then nearby transport pauses, then commanders have to reroute cargo, then trucks drive farther, then fuel consumption rises, then deliveries arrive later, then frontline units ration shells more carefully, then repair crews get less breathing room, then every commander starts worrying not only about what has been destroyed, but about what might be next. That is the quiet power of deep strike warfare. It turns logistics into psychology. And that is where the phrase, "then this happened," stops sounding like clickbait and starts sounding accurate. Because what often happens after these strikes is not one dramatic collapse. It is something more dangerous for Russia, uncertainty spreading through the system. In the earlier Jankoy case, traffic was suspended. In another Crimea strike sequence, authorities briefly suspended road traffic on the Kerch Bridge after an ammunition depot explosion in central Crimea. That shows the wider effect these attacks can produce. The target may be one storage point, but the response can spill into transport corridors that carry military and civilian movement alike. And once that happens, the message is clear. No route is fully routine anymore. No depot is truly rear area. No shipment is guaranteed to arrive without fear. That is the real battlefield change. Ukraine is trying to make Crimea feel exposed, busy, expensive, and hard to defend, not once, repeatedly. Another report this year described satellite confirmation of damage to buildings near Mezhyria in occupied Crimea that were reportedly used to store artillery ammunition for Russian forces. The report said the strike was part of a wider series of attacks carried out to reduce the operational activity of Russian forces, while another recent Ukrainian strike reportedly targeted a fuel train at the loading ramp of the Gvardievske oil depot in Crimea. Read that carefully and the logic becomes obvious. Ammunition, fuel, rail handling points, bridges, command posts, these are not random targets. They are the bloodstream. And when you attack the bloodstream, you do not need to destroy the entire body in one night. You only need to keep reducing its ability to move. That is why some of the most important strikes in modern war are not the loudest. A frontline trench explosion looks dramatic on video, But a depot strike 100 kilometers away can shape what happens at the front days later. Fewer shells, slower rotations, longer delays, more pressure on already stretched drivers and engineers, more time spent hiding assets instead of using them. Ukraine's broader actions in and around Crimea show the same idea from multiple angles. Kyiv Post reported that Ukrainian strikes targeted railway bridges near Rozdolna and Vladislavivka in occupied Crimea, and that Ukrainian officials described these bridges as routes used by Russian forces to transport military cargo and sustain occupation troops on the peninsula. The same reporting framed the strikes as part of a campaign to choke off logistics to Crimea and force Russian withdrawals. So now step back and look at the map as a system, not as a set of separate incidents. You have the Kerch rail route from the east. You have the northern road and rail connections around Jankoy. You have the land corridor running through occupied southern Ukraine. You have depots, transfer points, fuel infrastructure, and bridges that support the entire machine. If Ukraine keeps touching each of those points, even without a spectacular breakthrough, it changes the cost of holding Crimea and the southern front. Every shell Russia fires must first survive storage, transport, unloading, concealment, and final delivery. Every liter of fuel must make the trip. Every convoy must get through. War is often presented as movement at the front, but before movement comes supply. Before supply comes storage. Before storage comes safe territory. Ukraine is attacking the idea that Crimea is safe territory, and that could be one of the most important strategic shifts of the war. Here's what makes this especially serious for Moscow. Russia does not just need Crimea as a political trophy, it needs Crimea as infrastructure. Air bases, naval facilities, rail links, fuel handling, command nodes, repair activity, stockpiles, radar coverage, and lines feeding the southern theater all connect to the peninsula in different ways. Even if a single drone strike destroys only part of one depot, the larger effect can force Russia to spread out storage, increase air defense coverage, move supplies farther back, and spend more resources protecting rear areas that once felt secure. That sounds manageable until it keeps happening, because every defensive adaptation has a price. Spread out ammunition, and you reduce the risk of one catastrophic blast, but you increase transport time. Move depots farther from exposed zones, and you improve survivability, but you lengthen delivery chains. Use more air defenses around logistics sites, and you protect the rear better, but you also tie down systems that could defend other military targets. Run more shipments at night, and you lower visibility, but you slow handling and create bottlenecks. Nothing is free. That is what attritional strategy looks like when it is done well. It does not always produce one cinematic turning point. It produces a growing tax on the enemy's entire system. And this is where Russian military bloggers and analysts have shown visible concern. Forces News said some Russian military bloggers compared the current pressure on logistics to the pattern seen before Russia's withdrawal from Kherson in 2022, when Ukrainian forces spent months degrading supply lines before defensive positions became far harder to sustain. That comparison does not mean Crimea is about to collapse tomorrow. Serious analysis should avoid fantasy. Russian defenses remain substantial. Russia adapts. It disperses assets. It hardens positions. It increases electronic warfare. It improves camouflage. And it still has mass. But the comparison matters because it captures a fear. Not the fear of one explosion. The fear of a process. A process where each strike is survivable, but the accumulation is not. If this breakdown is helping you see the war more clearly, hit like right now, subscribe for future deep dives, and send this video to the one friend who always asks, why does one depot strike matter so much? Now let's talk about what may have happened after the strike in human terms, not just military terms. When an ammunition depot goes up, commanders do not only count damaged buildings, they start asking brutal questions. What was inside? How much was inside? Was it meant for Crimea-based forces, for the southern front, or for multiple sectors? Was the stockpile already scheduled for movement? Were any records destroyed? Was surveillance compromised? Did local air defenses fail, or did the strike overwhelm them? Were there drones we did not see? Are nearby depots now at risk? Do we move everything tonight, or wait and risk a second hit? That internal confusion is part of the attack. People often imagine logistics as cold and mechanical, but logistics is run by tired officers, drivers, rail staff, engineers, and warehouse crews making decisions under stress. Once repeated strikes enter the picture, mistakes increase, panic grows, overcorrections happen, cargo gets rerouted badly, assets are moved too late or moved too often, reports become noisier, communication clogs, units ask for resupply faster because they no longer trust the pipeline. This is why modern drone warfare is so dangerous even when the drone itself is relatively cheap. The weapon can be low cost, the consequence is not. A drone does not need to destroy all of Crimea to reshape Russian behavior in Crimea. It only needs to force caution everywhere, and caution in war can be contagious. The Russian side then faces a dilemma. If officials admit a strike caused meaningful disruption, they confirm vulnerability. If they minimize it, they may look detached from visible damage and local disruption. If they evacuate civilians, suspend traffic, or close routes, they are acting rationally for safety, but they also signal that the threat is real enough to interrupt daily life. We saw versions of that dynamic in the reported evacuations and traffic suspensions tied to Crimea depot incidents. That matters politically as well as militarily. Crimea has always occupied a special place in Russian messaging about the war. It is presented not as a temporary battlefield zone, but as settled, integrated, secured. So every time traffic halts, every time air defenses fire overhead, every time a fuel site burns, every time civilians are told to move away from a depot, that image takes damage, even if only a little. And war is partly about images, not fake images, operational images. The sense populations and soldiers have of whether control is firm or slipping, whether rear areas are calm or haunted, whether time is working for you or against you. Ukraine is trying to create the feeling that time is no longer Russia's friend in Crimea. That is a subtle but powerful goal, because if Russian troops, occupiers, and support personnel begin to feel that Crimea is under constant pressure, then every other Ukrainian action becomes stronger. Sabotage feels more plausible. Bridge strikes feel more meaningful. Rumors travel faster. Security costs rise. Local military movement becomes slower and more cautious. And from Ukraine's point of view, that is efficient warfare. You are not just destroying supplies, you are imposing friction. Let's bring in another layer, geography. Occupied Crimea is useful to Russia, but it is also constrained. It is a peninsula. That sounds obvious, but in military planning, it matters enormously. Peninsulas can be powerful launch pads, yet they are also dependent on a limited number of routes and nodes. When you concentrate too much value into a geography with limited arteries, every bridge, rail line, depot, and transfer hub becomes more important. That is why attacks on rail bridges near Rozdolna and Vladislavivka matter. That is why pressure around Jankoy matters. That is why strikes on fuel infrastructure matter. This is not random harassment. It is a campaign against the geometry of occupation. The more Russia depends on Crimea to support operations in the south, the more Ukraine benefits from making Crimea hard to use. And the more Russia tries to defend every critical point, the more it reveals how many critical points there really are. There is also a technological lesson here. Reports suggest Ukraine has been using cheaper, more flexible drone systems in a sustained logistics hunting role rather than saving every effort for a rare symbolic target. Forces News described the use of mid-range drones against trucks, tankers, depots, and maintenance vehicles, part of a shift from occasional long-range strikes to a more sustained effort against logistics across Crimea and the southern land corridor. That is smart warfighting, because a strategy built on repeated affordable disruption can sometimes outperform a strategy built on rare, expensive spectacle. One dramatic strike gets headlines. 30 smaller logistics hits can change a campaign, and that is likely the deeper meaning of this story. The depot strike is the visible event. The invisible event is the growing pressure on Russia's ability to treat Crimea as a dependable military reservoir. Now, does this mean Ukraine has solved the southern war? No, absolutely not. Russia still has significant manpower, firepower, engineering capacity, and the ability to absorb losses that would cripple many other states. It still controls territory connecting mainland Russia to Crimea through occupied southern Ukraine. It still has layered air defenses and electronic warfare systems. It still learns, but Ukraine does not need perfection for this strategy to matter. It needs persistence. That is the uncomfortable truth for Moscow. Rear area disruption is rarely judged by one night. It is judged by whether the next month becomes more expensive than the last one, whether the supply map gets longer, whether commanders become more conservative, whether transport nodes require more guards, more decoys, more rerouting, more repair, more delay. And if that continues, the front eventually feels it. Not always immediately, but eventually. Artillery units that expect abundance learn restraint. Mechanized units wait longer for parts. Fuel planning gets tighter. Bridge repairs get prioritized over other tasks. Drivers take riskier routes or slower routes. Ammunition dumps become smaller and more scattered. Everything starts taking more effort. And there is a battlefield consequence that often gets overlooked when people talk about supply chains in abstract terms. Frontline combat is built on tempo. Tempo is not just speed, it is the ability to keep acting before the enemy fully recovers. Fire, move, repair, resupply, rotate, repeat. If any link in that cycle starts dragging, units do not just become weaker, they become more predictable. They fire less often, they move less boldly, they conserve more, they delay decisions because they are no longer sure what support will actually arrive. That is where a depot strike can echo far beyond the crater. Imagine a Russian battery commander who believes he has enough shells for aggressive fire over the next 72 hours. Now imagine that a strike in Crimea raises doubts about the next shipment. Even if the shells still come, the commander may start acting as if scarcity has already arrived. He may hold back fire. He may reject requests he would normally approve. He may save ammunition for emergencies instead of shaping the battlefield. The result is subtle, but real. Operational behavior changes before physical shortage becomes absolute. The same logic applies to fuel. Armored vehicles are powerful only if they can move when needed, train when possible, and reposition when threatened. If repeated strikes on fuel infrastructure or convoys make deliveries less certain, commanders become cautious with movement. Caution sounds sensible. In practice, it can make a force less elastic. A less elastic force is slower to exploit openings and slower to respond when pressure hits. This is why logistics warfare can feel invisible to outside audiences while being painfully obvious to the men trying to fight through it. They feel it in the waiting. They feel it in the changed orders. They feel it when repair jobs are delayed because one missing part did not arrive. They feel it when trucks are redirected for security reasons and show up hours late. They feel it when higher command keeps asking for updated stock numbers because confidence in the system is fading. And once confidence starts fading, every rumor becomes more dangerous. In a stressed rear area, rumors do not stay rumors for long. One blast leads to talk of a second blast. One road closure leads to fear of a bigger strike package. One depot hit leads to speculation that the enemy has found the pattern of your storage system. Whether those fears are fully true almost does not matter at first. What matters is that people begin planning around them. That is another hidden effect of repeated Ukrainian strikes in Crimea. They can force Russia to spend energy chasing uncertainty. More patrols, more inspections, more decoys, more movement of assets that may not have needed moving yesterday, more pressure on commanders to prove they are in control. And the more energy you spend managing fear in the rear, the less energy you have for initiative at the front. That is what "then this happened" may really mean here. Not that Russia lost Crimea overnight, but that another layer of confidence may have been stripped away. And when confidence goes, capacity often follows later. If you've made it this far, here's my second ask. Subscribe if you want analysis that connects the blast you saw to the strategy you didn't. Drop a like so more viewers find this, and share it with someone who thinks logistics is boring because wars are won there first. There is one more reason this story deserves attention. These attacks force a strategic argument inside Russia, whether officials admit it or not. How much of Crimea can truly be protected? What is the efficient way to defend a peninsula full of military value? Is it better to concentrate depots and accept risk, or disperse them and accept inefficiency? Do you pull more air defense units into Crimea, or keep them elsewhere? Do you keep moving supplies through familiar routes, or create alternate flows that are slower and less developed? None of those choices is comfortable. That means Ukraine is not only attacking equipment, it is attacking decision quality. A commander under pressure starts choosing between bad options, and that is usually where strategic erosion begins. There is also a wider audience watching all this, not just soldiers, allies, intelligence services, defense planners. Everyone wants to know whether Crimea remains a durable Russian fortress or is becoming a vulnerable operational burden. Every successful strike, every confirmed fire, every traffic halt, every hit on fuel or rail infrastructure feeds that assessment. That matters because wars are not fought only on battlefields. They are fought in expectations. If more outside observers conclude that Crimea is vulnerable, then the strategic conversation changes. Aid planning changes. Russian deterrence messaging weakens. Ukrainian pressure gains credibility. And credibility, once earned, is powerful. It tells your partners that your strategy is not random. It tells your enemy that your reach is growing. It tells the people living under occupation that the rear is no longer untouchable. This is also why precision matters in how we talk about these events. The temptation online is to turn every strike into proof that total collapse is imminent. That is lazy analysis. Serious observers should resist it. One depot strike can be important without being magical. One bridge hit can matter without ending the war. One fuel fire can signal vulnerability without guaranteeing breakthrough. But the opposite mistake is just as bad. Treating these strikes as routine background noise misses the cumulative reality. Ukraine is not trying to win the information war with one clip. It is trying to bend the logistics war over time. And over time, enough pressure on the right nodes can force even a larger military to operate in a smaller, slower, more defensive way. That is the strategic horizon behind this headline. So when you hear that Ukrainian drones struck an ammunition depot supplying Crimea, do not picture only a warehouse. Picture timing tables, route maps, fuel accounting, rail scheduling, convoy spacing, repair cycles, officer briefings, night movements, emergency dispersal orders, bridge inspections, stockpile audits, fear of follow-on strikes. That is where the real damage lives. Sometimes the blast destroys ammunition. Sometimes it destroys assumptions, and assumptions are harder to replace. For years, Russia wanted Crimea to project permanence, but a place can look permanent on a map and still become fragile in practice. Fragility does not begin with surrender. It begins when the system behind the front becomes stressed, redundant routes become essential, and ordinary movement starts requiring extraordinary effort. That is what Ukraine appears to be chasing. Not the illusion of one perfect knockout, but the reality of repeated operational suffocation. And if that sounds slow, remember this. Slow pressure is exactly how many strong positions are broken, not by one blow that everybody sees coming, but by many blows that together make normal function impossible. The Southern War may turn on that principle. Keep the troops fed, fueled, armed, and connected, and a line can hold for a very long time. Break the rhythm of that supply even bit by bit, and the strongest line begins to change character. It becomes less flexible, less confident, less able to recover from surprise. That is why an ammunition depot in Crimea is never just an ammunition depot. It is a test of whether Russia can still protect the machinery behind its southern war. It is a test of whether Ukraine can keep reaching deeper. And it is a warning that the battle for Crimea may be fought as much through transport, storage, and fuel as through any famous frontline assault. So what happened after the strike? Maybe the most honest answer is this. What happened is that another crack may have appeared in the system. Russia depends on to hold Crimea and support the southern front. Another reminder that depots can burn, routes can pause, bridges can be threatened, and rear areas can become contested space. Another signal that Ukraine is not only hunting targets, it is hunting predictability. And in war, once predictability dies, everything gets harder. Harder to move, harder to hide, harder to reassure your own people, harder to promise that Crimea is secure. That is why this strike matters. Not because it produced the loudest explosion of the war, but because it fits a larger pattern that may slowly turn one of Russia's greatest military assets into one of its most expensive liabilities. And if Ukraine keeps this pressure up on depots, on bridges, on fuel sites, on convoys, on the narrow arteries that make Crimea useful, then the real story will not be one attack. The real story will be the moment Russia realizes that holding Crimea is no longer the same as using Crimea. Before you go, do this final one for me. If this script gave you a clearer picture than the headlines did, like the video, subscribe for the next breakdown, and share it so someone else can finally understand why logistics targets can shake an entire war. Because in modern war, the side that loses its supply rhythm often loses far more than supplies. It loses initiative, it loses certainty, and sometimes, long before it loses territory, it loses the feeling that the territory is truly under control. That is the part people miss. And that may be exactly what just happened in Crimea.